On the night of Saturday, June 11, 1815, a tense atmosphere enveloped over 200,000 soldiers. Sleep came to them fitfully and uneasily, because dawn would mark a fateful day, a day etched in history with blood and tears. For 12 consecutive years, war burned across the European continent, from the arid fields of Portugal to the cold, icy lands of Russia. Before that, France was bogged down in wars in North Africa and the Middle East, with the British Empire always being its arch-rival on land and sea, and the two powers were in constant confrontation. Millions of lives have been taken away. Millions of others have wandered around becoming victims of war. By June 1815, fate came to signal a tragic end. On the battlefield of Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte will have a confrontation with his sworn enemies, closing an era full of pain and cruelty. The beginning of the end. In 1812, the French Empire under the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte reached the pinnacle of power stretching across the European continent. But Napoleon's boundless ambition pushed him to the brink of failure. The invasion of mighty Russia was a terrible disaster, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, not by swords and spears, but by the harsh and unforgiving cold of the Russian winter. The humiliating defeat in Russia sparked Napoleon's downfall. The War of the Sixth Coalition broke out with a coalition of hostile nations and conquered peoples united in rebellion, determined to overthrow French rule. By 1815, exhausted France was defeated, and on April 4th of that year, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the remote island of Elba in the Mediterranean. However, the fire of ambition in Napoleon had not yet extinguished. Less than 10 months later, he escaped from captivity and returned to France, triggering a short but turbulent historical period known as the 100 Days, and the climax of this period is the famous Battle of Waterloo. 100 fateful days. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon returned to France and began his march toward Paris. Not counting a few townspeople in Provence, French people from all over flocked to follow Napoleon. Faced with Napoleon's unexpected return, European powers immediately met in Vienna. They declared Napoleon the common enemy of all of Europe and decided that each country would mobilize an army of 150,000 men to deal with any force Napoleon could muster. Britain, with its powerful financial potential, sponsored allies to compensate for the shortage of troops. Although the plan to attack France was launched on 1 June, both the Prussian and British army commanders, Blucher and Wellington, believed that it was too late. Delay will only create conditions for Napoleon to consolidate his forces and prepare for the upcoming war. The first battle took place along the Sambre and Charleroi rivers, where the French under Napoleon's command crushed the Prussian outposts. This lightning victory gave Napoleon an extremely advantageous strategic position in the center, allowing him to easily deal with the British in the west and the Prussians in the east. On June 16th, the war really broke out with two major battles at Quatre Bras and Ligny. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most talented generals, succeeded in stopping a mixed Anglo-Dutch force, preventing them from joining forces with the Prussian army stationed on the left flank of German France. This is the key to Napoleon's strategy: divide and rule. By preventing the Allied armies from uniting, he was able to defeat each army one by one. Although the Prussians were outnumbered, they suffered a tactical defeat at Ligny. Napoleon now held a clear strategic advantage with his two Allied armies divided. He sent Marshal Grouchy to pursue the fleeing Prussian army, while he himself led the main army west, aiming at the next target, the British army, which was weaker in numbers. On the night of June 17th, the British and Allied armies retreated to a position near a small town called Waterloo. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, Wellington had chosen the location deliberately. As an experienced general, Wellington had studied the terrain of Waterloo carefully and knew how to take full advantage of it. Waterloo was an excellent natural defensive position with fortified farms and a gentle slope that concealed the numbers and movements of the army, and protected them from artillery fire. The gently sloping terrain also gave the defending infantry an advantage in range and angle of fire. Luring Napoleon to Waterloo was the first step in Wellington's victory. The beginning of the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, one of the most important battles in European history, saw a tense confrontation between Napoleon and Wellington. Napoleon's goal was to separate the British and Prussian forces, then drive the Prussians out to sea. On his part, Wellington concentrated on holding the position, taking advantage of Waterloo's terrain and strong defenses, including the farms, Hougoumont, and La Haye-Sainte. At around 10 a.m., the first shots of the battle rang out as the French launched an attack on Hougoumont. Although historians still debate Hougoumont's true importance, both Napoleon and Wellington were well aware that this strategic position was the key to victory. Napoleon intended to use Hougoumont as a lure, drawing British reserves away from the main defense line. However, the fierce resistance of the British Army reversed the situation. Throughout the day, both sides used considerable forces in the battle for Hougoumont. The initial French attack pushed the British back from the surrounding woods, but they were also pushed back by British artillery. The climax of the second attack was an impressive moment. Lieutenant Legros, a French officer, used an axe to break the Temple Gate to let the French army rush in. A fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued between the French and the famous English Coldstream and Scots Guards. In the end, the British army regained control of the gate. The French army fought to the last man. Only one drummer boy was spared by the British army. The muddy terrain made it difficult for the French artillery, but they eventually reached the British. Although most of the British troops were shielded by the gentle hillside that acted as a defensive line, French artillery fire still caused significant damage. The main attack. At around 1:15 p.m., concerns began to appear on the political scene. Napoleon discovered the first Prussian troops moving east toward the French position. Although the Prussians needed several more hours to get close enough to pose a direct threat, time was clearly no longer on Napoleon's side. He was forced to find a way to penetrate Wellington's defense line as soon as possible. The main attack of the French infantry was launched. Long lines of troops advanced toward the British, isolating the La Haye-Sainte farm that was being protected by the King's German Legion. The King's German Legion fought stubbornly, causing significant delays to the French advance. Realizing the critical situation, Prince William of Orange, commander of the Dutch army, dispatched Hanover's Lunenburg battalion to reinforce La Haye-Sainte. However, this battalion was discovered by French cavalry and was quickly destroyed. This was one of the mistakes the Prince of Orange made during the battle, causing him to be viewed as a burden by Wellington, who was already unfavorable. The French army continued to put terrible pressure on the British left flank, with heavy attacks causing Wellington's defense line to shake violently. By 3 p.m., the situation became extremely dangerous. If the Prussian army did not arrive in time, the British defense line was in danger of completely collapsing. In a desperate attempt, Wellington threw 2 heavy cavalry brigades into battle to support the infantry. The powerful charge of the British cavalry pushed back the French army, stopping the enemy's attack, but this short-lived victory quickly turned into a disaster. Blinded by temporary excitement, the British cavalry crossed the limit of the attack. They rushed through La Haye-Sainte, aggressively rushing straight into the center of the French formation. As a result, when approaching the enemy, the British cavalry was completely exhausted and lost formation. They became easy targets for French pikemen and cavalry. This suicide attack gave the French the advantage, but they needed to act quickly before it was too late. The hollow square blocks. At about 4 p.m., Field Marshal Ney observed an unusual movement in the British ranks. They are moving backwards. Thinking that this was the beginning of a retreat, Ney decided to seize this golden opportunity to launch a decisive attack. However, Ney's assessments were a fatal mistake. The British simply moved the wounded to safety. Furthermore, with the French infantry bogged down in fierce fighting at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, Ney could rely almost exclusively on cavalry for this attack. The first assault with about 4,800 cavalry was quickly repelled. Ney was not discouraged, launching a second wave with a scale nearly double the first. The results were not much better. Witnessing this scene from afar, Napoleon could not help but exclaim that the attack had taken place too soon. What caused the French cavalry attacks to fail so miserably? The answer lies in the ingenious defensive tactics of the British infantry. They quickly formed hollow square formations, with bayonets fixed and muskets pointed all around. Natural instinct makes horses not dare to rush into this block of barbed steel. And hidden behind a barrage of sharp bayonets, the British infantry calmly opened fire, inflicting heavy casualties on the French cavalry, who had no way to reach their target. No one knows exactly how many waves of French cavalry charged into the English infantry squares during that chaotic battle. The thick smoke and confusion of the battlefield made it impossible to determine exactly when each charge began and ended. What is certain, however, is that each charge was repulsed, and each time the English cavalry launched a counterattack. Ultimately, Ney's charge ended in disaster. His cavalry was almost completely wiped out. In a last-ditch effort, Ney launched a combined infantry and cavalry charge, but this too was quickly defeated by the English Royal Cavalry. Although the infantry squares were successful in stopping the French attacks, the British also suffered significant losses. Intense French artillery fire during the interval between assaults caused many British casualties. Time was not over for Napoleon. He still had enough troops and time to turn the tide of the battle. Attaque on la Haie Sainte. At the same time that Ney's cavalry was risking its life against the squares of British infantry, in another part of the battlefield, the French infantry had also regrouped and launched a fierce attack on La Haie Sainte. This time, luck was not on the side of the defenders. Ammunition was almost exhausted. They were forced to retreat from this important defensive position. Their resistance was not in vain. It was this valuable delay that stopped the French army's advance, giving the British army more time to consolidate its formation. Across the battlefield, the situation was now hanging by a thread. The heavy French attacks stretched the British army to the point of almost breaking. Many of Wellington's talented officers were falling, and he himself was trapped in a square block of infantry, almost out of touch with the rest of his army. While Wellington struggled to maintain the fragile cohesion of his army, the French artillery was ordered to move closer forward, continuously pouring terrible fire into the British formation. However, the situation of the French army was not much brighter. Intelligence said that the British Allied Prussian army was getting very close. Napoleon knew that he needed to crush the British army before the Prussians could arrive to their rescue. Time is running out. The Prussian army arrives. While the British army was almost exhausted and on the brink of collapse, the vanguard of the Prussian army finally appeared on the battlefield. Immediately, they headed towards Plancenoit, a small village located south of Napoleon's right flank, where the French army was holding. New fighting broke out at 4:30 p.m. An hour later, the flames of war had spread across the entire front line, stretching for miles. The Prussian army, with its fiery spirit, succeeded in linking up with the left flank of the British army, forming a siege that threatened the right flank of the French army. Meanwhile, the French were still waiting impatiently for reinforcements from Marshal Grouchy, who was said to be leading troops from Wavre, about 9 miles away. But instead of Grouchy and reinforcements, the French were faced with the sudden appearance of Prussian troops. The room's internal panic spread like an epidemic. The French army's morale completely collapsed. Their ranks began to disintegrate. The soldiers fled in disarray, while the Prussian army attacked fiercely to cut off their only route of retreat. In a final attempt to turn the situation around, Napoleon decided to launch the Veteran Guard, his most elite and loyal force, into battle. At 7:30 p.m., the Old Guard, experienced soldiers who had fought alongside Napoleon for many years, moved forward with determination to penetrate the British center. The British army was forced to retreat before the fierce attack of the Guards. However, a sudden and powerful counterattack by the Anglo-Dutch army, culminating in a bayonet charge, completely crushed Napoleon's last hopes. The Guards were beaten back. The entire French army began to retreat in chaos. Seeing the opportunity, The Anglo-Dutch army once again raised their hats into the air, signaling the entire army to counterattack. Some units of the veteran guard with absolute loyalty refused to surrender and fought to the last breath, but all were in vain. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. The Battle of Waterloo actually ended with a bitter defeat for Napoleon and France. The end of an era. The Battle of Waterloo was one of the bloodiest battles in European history. Thousands of soldiers died on the battlefield. Thousands more were injured or missing. Napoleon fled to Paris in the hope of gathering a new army, but his hopes quickly faded as his support plummeted. On June 24th, he abdicated for the second time, marking the end of an era. The Napoleonic era has officially ended. He was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he lived out his final days. The Battle of Waterloo is remembered by history as a landmark battle, ending a long and bloody era of war in Europe. After the battle, a period of relative peace and stability was established, until the Crimean War broke out in 1853.